unofficial right now. I'm going to ease my way into the half hour. We're still going to wait, right up to the last minute before we officially begin. So give everybody that plans to be here an opportunity to be here. So the groundhog spoke yesterday, and so 6 weeks of winter. So I thought, okay, well, so we'll just pull up by the fire a little closer, and read another book, and then maybe he'll be wrong. And so it's fascinating to me that we're February 2nd. Of course, today is February 4th, but February 2nd has been for a couple thousand years, if not longer, an important time as a transition between winter and spring. Shortest day of the season is the 22nd of December. That's where there's the least amount of light, the most amount of darkness. And then in late March, it's the spring equinox. Equinox meaning equal day and equal night. And in that transition, there's 40 days up to February 2nd, roughly, where it's the shortest time in terms of days and light. And then after February 2nd, it's roughly 40 days until it's brighter and brighter. So that's why in antiquity, in ancient times, the Celts would bring out candles and light them on February 2nd, symbolizing there was a tipping point between the days getting finally longer and the birth of new animals and the spring planting. And it was a way of looking forward to that kind of thing. And seeing shadows and all that. People were superstitious, but groundhogs would go into hibernation in December when everything was bleakest. And they came out once, about 40 days, and they lost a lot of weight by that point because they've been hibernating and their heart rate was incredibly slow. They'd come out, take a look around, and then go back under the barn or the burrow. And farmers would say, oh, there they are, and they would think, oh, it must be February 2nd. Did he see a shadow? And then over time it became this thing to look for about the midway point between shorter days and longer days. So it's a nice tradition to still have with us. So we'll go ahead and officially begin then. And thank you again for being here for the winter lectures. Today's talk's on reading between the lines, soldier impressions. Tomorrow there's going to be an excellent talk on the archaeology that's been done on Little Round Top by archaeologists, and we're excited about that. So be here at the same time tomorrow at 1:30. And my program, though, is doing a little bit of archaeology of the mind and the subconscious. So instead of digging up actual artifacts or stumbling onto artifacts that are unearthed, I'm going to be unearthing thoughts deep within the subconscious and breaking down letters. And here and there you'll notice where the left flank and the right flank was and how many paces somebody charged forward. They may mention that in the letter, but we're gonna pick up on the deeper subconscious thoughts that appear in the letters and draw them out and give them meaning. So we're going to do an archaeology of the mind, if you will. Soldier impressions is what I'm calling it. Now, I also want to say to you right up front, this is, you all know I use a lot of visuals if you've come to my lectures before. And I'm not today on purpose, because in the early 19th century up to the mid-19th century, about the time of the Civil War, there weren't a lot of illustrations. Newspapers were starting to use wooden blocks, and they would carve a sketch, for instance, done on a battlefield, and then dip it in ink and print it along with type in a newspaper. But there were very few visuals when you read. And so because there were few visuals, you had to be visual with your language. You had to make up for not having visuals. People were largely anonymous during that period too. There were physiognotraces in the late 1700s were starting to, it was an instrument that cast a shadow on a wall, and you'd draw a sketch of the shadow and it showed a profile of the person. And in the late 1700s, early 1800s, you start to have your first newspaper personalities because they have an image that you can look at. But largely people were anonymous. You didn't know who they were. The idea of you and I knowing personalities on the radio and television and blogs, and people having followings on social media. That's a modern idea. I remember when I started out with the Park Service at Appomattox in 1984, where Lee surrendered to Grant, a lot of the Southerners saw one of General Grant's staff officers named Rawlings ride up to speak with Lee and said, "Hey, Grant's going to meet with you about what you want to talk about. You choose the location." A lot of Southerners thought they had seen General Grant. They were looking at Rawlings, the staff officer. And how can you fight against someone for 4 years and not even know what they look like? But back then there was a lot of anonymity, and so when you wrote, you had to make up for there not being pictures with word pictures. People ask, why do they write so flowery? It's because they did so without images, for the most part. You might have an upscale book that had a few sketches, or go back to the Middle Ages and find an illuminated manuscript, but it's largely words, so you had to make up for what people couldn't see with words. So notice how flowery everything is, and I'll say more about this as we go along. But I want you to get lost in the literary art today rather than the visual arts as we look at these soldier. One other upfront point to make too is that people kept journals back then. And I was talking to Bill Conover about this recently. He's one of the volunteers in the park, and he taught for over 3 decades as a professor of history at University of Scranton, and we were talking about this 2 days ago. He said, remember now, mention journals to them. And I said, thank you. In the 19th century, people kept journals. You don't have to raise your hand, but think to yourself, when you were a kid, did you ever have a journal with a little lock on it, and a key, or maybe just something like, and you would write. And the good things about keeping a journal is that you write down impressions that you have that you may not want anyone else to see, and perhaps it's even a way of purging something. But they say that's one of the ways to heal a lot of times. Write down what it is that's bothering you, and then burn it. Destroy it, tear it up. It's a way of getting it out of you. And I think these soldiers were writing. They were purging thoughts that they had that were repetitive. They couldn't get rid of, and they had grown up in a society that urged you to write a journal, to sit down and be honest with yourself and be expressive. And if you went to college back then, we're going to see Frank Haskell here in a few minutes in his accounts. He went to Dartmouth. He would have studied Cato and Cicero and Plato and Shakespeare. And so you were taught to write that way. He would have also been taught what's called Bell's Letters. Bell's Letters was a flowery type of expressive speech in an era where there were few illustrations. So we're going to have word pictures in front of us here. And we're going to try to break them down and get into the deeper thoughts of the subject. We're going to do some archaeology of the mind. Okay, we'll start out with Private John Dooley. He was in Pickett's charge with the 1st Virginia from Richmond, and they were in the area of the Henry Spangler barn that's still out there in the fields of Pickett's charge. And that's about where they were located, where they laid on their wool blankets and waited for 2 hours. During the Great Cannonade, they were there even before that, baking in the sun. And then they were told to rise to their feet and make an attack. And so John Dooley talks about this. He wrote memoirs after the war, and this is an excerpt on Gettysburg. By the way, he survived several major battles, and he was wounded in Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and various places. He said, I tell you, there is no romance in making one of these charges. You might think so from reading Charlie O'Malley, that prodigy of valor, or in reading of any other gallant knight who would as little think of riding over gunners as they would of eating a dozen oysters. But when you rise to your feet as we did today, I tell you the enthusiasm of ardent breast in many cases ain't there. And instead of burning to avenge the insults of our country, families and altars and firesides, the thought is most frequently, oh, if I could just come out of this chart safely, how thankful would I be? That's a real honest expression there. I've highlighted terms in blue that we're going to focus on. And the word romance is very important, and so is the word valor. He said, I tell you, there is no romance in making one of these charges. And what he's telling you is war's dirty business. It's like Ellis Spear, who disagreed with Joshua Chamberlain, and they went back and forth, and wasn't a lot of love lost between them on 20th Maine. And Spear's complaint with Chamberlain as a professor was very flowery in his writing. We've already talked about that. He wrote in an epic style, and Spear was, war is dirty work. It's like hoeing a field or a garden. You get dirt under your fingernails. There's a lot of sweat. Your back hurts afterwards. It's something that has to be done. There's no glory to be found in it. And so that rubbed him the wrong way with Chamberlain, who would make out the story to be very sweeping and moving and gallant. Of course, if Chamberlain hadn't done that, we probably wouldn't be drawn into the story quite like we are today. And for the folks that arrived, just come on down and find a seat. There's some here in the middle, and there's some over here, and people won't mind if you come down. So there's no romance in war. It's just hard labor, and it's something that has to be done, and it's dirty work. But also there's something else going on here. He says, I tell you, there is no romance. And he relates this to a gallant knight and Charlie O'Malley. You all may know that in the 19th century, the Waverley Diaries, the Waverley writings, were very popular. And Walter Scott wrote them. But there were other folks who wrote in the early 19th century about knights in shining armor. And what was going on there is the idea, and the chivalric code sort of made a return. And what is that all about? It's about, how many of you have heard of Romanticism? Romanticism was a literary movement, and there was a visual arts aspect to it in the 19th century. To understand the Civil War generation, you really have to understand it. The idea of Romanticism was, it was a pushback against logic and reason of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, with Newton's laws, had explained the heavens scientifically with calculus. And Galileo had studied with a telescope. And Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and Machiavelli, Diderot, Hume, Bacon, and others had come along and created political science, while Newton and Galileo had created the science of the heavens. And then Napoleon would come along and create the science of war. And science eventually, the age of science eventually led to the Industrial Revolution, where people became appendages to a machine and everything was logically ordered and precise, and profit and capitalism and so forth. And there was a backlash, a push back to that in the late 1700s, early 1800s, called Romanticism. You've heard of Shelley, Keats, Byron, Melville, Poe, Hugo, Victor Hugo, Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were so tired of left brain. That's logic, reason, leading to this strict conformity of explaining everything through science. They wanted to feel. They wanted to trust their intuitions. They wanted to trust their instincts. They wanted imagination. They wanted Rapunzel's long hair. They wanted fire-breathing dragons. They wanted potions, magic potions from the Middle Ages. They liked the stories of Loch Ness monsters. This is 19th century. They wanted to remember the Middle Ages, some imagined past when superstition was okay. They were tired of Newton's laws of gravity. They were interested not so much in astronomy. They wanted to go back and look at astrology and the signs in the skies and the heavens. They wanted to feel. They wanted to have emotion, pathos, instincts, intuition, imagination. That's right brain. Artists draw upon right brain. And whenever there's a strong pull of science, there's always a little bit of a pushback by right brain to balance with left brain. So logic and reason balance out with intuition, imagination, and instinct. And so the Romantics came along, and they felt like industry which was an outgrowth of logic and reason, and the Enlightenment and science was destroying creativity. And the arts reflected this looking back to an imagined medieval past before the age of science too. In that, how many of you knew Big Ben with its spires in London? In Parliament was built in the 1850s, and the National Cathedral was built in the 19th century. I mean, this clearly looks like a Gothic castle or a cathedral. And how many of you have seen the Munsters or the Addams Family? 19th century people, Victorian people, were Gothic. The reason they wore black clothing, it was a throwback to monks' robes. And they wore black as a throwback to Gothic culture. Gothic was the visual representation of Romanticism, and then the literary writing. So the writings talked about, if you could buy novels back then, and novels were more plentiful thanks to the steam cylindrical press and the introduction of pulp paper. And there was this imagined past. There was Gothic and it was Romantic. And Dooley had read some of this, and he was saying, no, war's not like that. It's not like that imagined past. It's not like knights in shining armor. It's not like an imagined medieval past. No matter what the Romantics tell you, it's actually very dirty work. And then he talks about avenging the insults of our country. Our insults, that has to do with valor and honor. And I'm spending a little more time on this slide here. I'll move a lot quicker on the others, but I'm setting things up so it'll flow a lot easier going forward. But valor and honor are very, and we'll get into insults here briefly. Valor and honor are important words in the 19th century. We still use those words, but honor and valor have to do with your heritage and your family's reputation. And it has to do with your identity and your family's identity. I've already addressed this a little bit, but in the 19th century, people were largely anonymous. You arrive on a boat from Ireland in the 1830s or 40s in New York City or Boston, or from Germany and to those places in the 1840s, 1850s. And then you can move out west and change your name and no one would know any different. There were no records on you, there's no social security numbers, obviously no social media, no credit cards. People were anonymous. Their faces were not, there were a few photographs taken, but that was long before there were photographs posted on the web. So people were anonymous. And in that anonymity, women oftentimes would wear bonnets that only accentuate, they wore the bonnets to cover their hair to frame their face so that they could overemphasize with their expressions to let you know they were authentic and that they could be believed and they were credible. And in a place of anonymity, you had to go to great strides. So if someone insulted your family, you challenged them to a duel. Because if your family's reputation was destroyed, then you lost your identity. You disappeared. Your chances for a promotion in your work disappeared. Your whole family. There was a young man waiting to go into Pickett's charge, and I suppose he was 18 or 19 years of age, and he was standing there along with a mile of troops in line, and a Confederate officer rode up to him moments before the charge was ordered to go forward. The man's standing there as straight as he can, and the officer towers over him on his horse and starts talking to him about his father, who's a judge in Virginia. Conversation goes on a few minutes and talks about what a great man his father is, the judge. And then the officer kicks the side of his horse and gallops away. The man's still standing there trembling in line, waiting to go forward. And what that conversation was all about was, if you run today, you not only ruin your reputation, you ruin your father's reputation. So when they would say, remember your wives, remember your children, remember old Virginia, they're appealing to your emotions, but in some ways it's a guilt trip too. It's like your kids, you got to live up to your family name. And so that's why there were duels back then, is that somebody insulted you in the paper, you'd knock on their door, say, did you really say this? Oh, you did. Well, This is a Friday afternoon. I'll come back Monday. If you haven't retracted it in the paper, I know someone here that'll referee. You choose the weapons. We'll meet up on such and such a knoll. You might walk around the rest of your life with a wound from a duel, a limp. But everyone knew that you had stood up for your family's honor. And so that's what Dooley is talking about. And he's talking about avenging the insults. They thought of war as a gentleman's duel on a grand scale. It's one of the reasons why soldiers stood in front of each other at close range. It's a duel. You face your accuser out in the open. And they thought it was unvalorous for someone to hide by something and fire at them. Or a sharpshooter. Somebody's filling up a canteen of water and a sharpshooter strikes them from 300 yards away. That was unfair. You didn't allow me to have my sword, and you can have your sword, and someone refereed. There was this whole sense of fairness. So that's what valor means. Valor and honor is there's some shame and guilt involved, but it's living up to family expectations. Very different than the idea of conscience, which the Quakers introduced in the 19th century. It is, no, you're not locked into family tradition. You make a decision based on your conscience. Henry David Thoreau started that idea of acting out of conscience, conscientious objector. He didn't pay his taxes, didn't agree with industry, what it was doing, destroying the craft tradition, polluting the environment. He wouldn't pay his taxes, he went to jail, and somebody paid to get him out. That's acting on conscience. Okay, so Dooley is saying that war's not romance, and you don't even feel like avenging insults. It's dirty work. Okay. Now let's take a look here at Rufus Dawes. Now Rufus Dawes charged the railroad cut with the 6th Wisconsin on the first day of the battle. How many of you knew that? Okay, and so let's get into his writing and let's do some archaeology of the mind and look at these words that we might normally not pay attention to and see what it's telling us. He wrote, I now order the men to climb over the turnpike fences. That would be the Chambersburg Pike. This is on July 1st, 1863, the first day of the battle. And advance upon them. He's talking about North Carolinians and Mississippians who dropped down into a railroad cut. He said, I was not aware of the existence of a railroad cut and mistook the maneuver of the enemy, that's the Mississippians and the North Carolinians, for a retreat, but was soon undeceived by the heavy fire which they began at once to pour upon us from their cover in the cut. Captain John Tickner, a dashing soldier, one of our finest officers, fell dead while climbing the second fence of the Chambersburg Pike, and others were struck, but the line pushed on. All right, first off, he mentions railroad cut. And that's a word you might read past. We take it for granted. We know about the railroad cut. But let me give you a little bit of deeper cultural aspect to this idea of a railroad cut that Dawes at first, his black hatters, his Iron Brigade troops didn't see before they made the charge, where the rebels were hiding. Railroad cuts were very common on the Civil War battlefield. In the late 1980s, I worked for Bob Crick and at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And some of you know him. He's a legend in our field. And he starts his speeches, or he did years ago, with, you can't have a Civil War battle without the following: a wheat field, a peach orchard, a stone wall, a sunken road, and an unfinished railroad cut. I mean, they're the props for every battlefield. So why were there so many unfinished railroad cuts? Because it was a big boom in railroad construction in the 1830s and then into the 1840s and 1850s. And with that big boom came overextending. People overinvested or took on something that they couldn't pay off. Back then, there were few banks in the United States that had enough money to loan, and certainly no banks in the United States in the 1830s that had enough capital for an upstart railroad business. You couldn't find enough money in an American bank in the 1830s to buy a locomotive. So you could now, from a merchant who would come into New York Harbor from England, you take out a loan, a foreign loan, But in this country, the banks just hadn't matured to that point. The Industrial Revolution was in its infancy. And so if you wanted to build a railroad, state governments would allow you to pool your money and a charter. So you get a state charter, a number of people would pool their money together. And then the fares that were charged, a certain percentage would come back in the way of interest, and those who had invested would get that money back. And that led to structures and systems forming in the country. But in the railroad business, though, what really hurt the railroads is that people started investing in it like crazy, almost like the dot-com boom of the 90s, before our correction in the market in the early 2000s. And as a result, in 1838, the 1837-38, Andrew Jackson had killed the bank, essentially. It was in a war with a bank president named Biddle, and he appealed to his voters saying that banks represented privilege and interest. The common people should break up the banks. Well, the banks were starting to get more reliable, but then they were destroyed, so there was nothing to fall back on. And that, along with the crime of 37, one of the first economic depressions, led to the first railroads going belly up. That's why battlefields are filled with unfinished railroad cuts, with rails stacked nearby, but with just an empty cut. There's all kinds of rails stacked up with grass growing around it at the seminary, but it was never assembled. But the cut, or the grade, was made. Now, there's a difference between a cut and a fill. So if you have a rolling countryside, Seminary Ridge, and then a valley, as we're going from east to west, and then eastern McPherson Ridge, we go west further, a valley. Then western McPherson Ridge, and then further west, a valley. And then Hare Ridge, and then further west, another valley. And then Belmont Schoolhouse Ridge. That's all along the chambers. We're probably like taking an 8x11 piece of paper and you push it together and it creates a series of folds. So the Union Army, and before that the cavalry on the first day of the battle, used those folds to pop up like a jack-in-the-box and slow the Confederates fold to fold to fold to fold. All right, when the railroad cut was put in the 1830s, Thaddeus Stevens, the great abolitionist, was involved in that. Along with the charter, he had a lot of people pool money to be able to afford it. But when the grade was cut, they cut through the rises, that's the ridges, and then they would take the dirt that they literally cut out of the ridge, a McPherson Ridge or a Hare Ridge. They would take the dirt and put it in the valley that was just beyond that. That's a fill. Because railroads couldn't climb steep grades like this stairwell here. So you had to have everything level. So you took the dirt from the cut and you put it in the valley just beyond it to create a level space. Everybody see that? So when Dawes charged with his men, this is a historical point, the Confederates had actually gotten in the cut, not the fill. So when he attacked along with 2 New York regiments, Dawes had his 24th, he had his 6th Wisconsin go out to the right, or that is east of the railroad cut. And the 95th New York went out to the west of the railroad cut, and they went into the fills and closed the Confederates inside the cut. Does that make sense? That was the genius of the moment of their advance. Had they waited, the Confederates could have gotten back into the fill and they wouldn't have been stuck in this deep cut that they couldn't climb out with soft dirt. Okay, so that's a historical point. Now you notice he says a dashing soldier, one of our finest officers, fell dead. That's a reference to PTSD. Don't forget that. I'm going to come back to that. A dashing soldier, one of our finest, fell dead while climbing the second fence. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the archaeology of the mind and impressions, soldier impressions. It says of the 6th Wisconsin, we were now receiving a fearfully destructive fire from the hidden enemy. That's the ones in the railroad cut. Men who had been shot were leaving the ranks in crowds. Any correct picture of this charge would represent a V-shaped crowd of men with the colors at the advanced point, moving firmly and hurriedly forward, while the whole field behind is streaming with men who have been shot and who are struggling to the rear or sinking in death upon the ground. These are very vivid descriptions, by the way. He's purging thoughts here. And this was published in the Mullis Papers, Military Order, Loyal Legion of the United States, years after the battle. So he finally came to grips with it. Notice in the first sentence before, he said, I now order the men to climb. You can tell he's looking at the results of his order, okay, and he's feeling responsible for it. Now, V-shaped crowd of men. This is very important. That's another little hidden gem in the letter. A lot of times when you imagine soldiers out on a battlefield, they're lined in two parallel lines. Front rank fires while the rear rank loads. Rear rank fires while the front rank loads, and they take turns. And alternates companies A, C, and E fire while B, D, and F load. And that's how they created an intermittent fire with muzzle loaders that took 20 seconds to load. It's how you continue to bring about a firepower. And then every so often they would all fire together, and those volleys, they would stop the enemy in their tracks and break the morale of the other side. But you might fire for a half hour and have intermittent fire, and then there would be these well-timed volleys where the entire regiment fired at the same time, 400 or 500 men. But a lot of folks imagine they stay in that line, and that's not the case. Once soldiers got within firing range, about 300 paces, the infamous 300 paces, Napoleon called it, or 100 yards. They didn't remain in perfect lines. Oftentimes they formed into a V shape. And in this case, they're moving forward and the flag's out front and the men are forming a V from it. But this is typical in a battle. A V shape will form because once the two sides come within 100 yards of each other, and they're in their parallel lines and they're firing front rank, rear rank, there's always a few men that just seem to think more clearly, breathe more clearly. It's something about their composition. They're not as afraid. They feel more alive. And they'll just walk forward closer to the enemy. And there are other guys that are not so comfortable with that. And they'll sort of stand behind partially one of their shoulders. And that creates a V from the guy who steps forward. He's the point. And then people form to his right and left. And so some kind of U or V shape forms over time from those that are more comfortable going to the front and those that are not. But notice he's getting really detailed about sinking and death. And that's sinking and death. These are very visual terms. Meanwhile, Dawes says, the colors were down upon the ground several times in their charge to the railroad cut, but were raised at once by the heroes of the color guard. There's your word, heroes. Heroes is a term that Romanticism creates, the idea of knights in shining armor. 19th century is very much into heroes. That's why the rise of individualism is in the 19th century. Rockefeller and Carnegie and Gould and Ford and Edison, wizards of inventions and industrial bosses. The idea that Lincoln could go from a log cabin to the White House, or that Carnegie could go from polishing boots out front of the factory to owning the factory. That couldn't have existed in a previous century. Only in the United States could that exist, and only post-French and American Revolution did that start to exist in the West. So heroes are there. When you look at the monuments out on the battlefield, you think, why are there all these monuments to men on horses? They're heroes. They are Charlemagne on a horse. That's Gothic. That's Romanticism being brought from the ancient past, the imagined past, onto a battlefield. By the way, why are there no monuments to Eisenhower on a horse? He didn't ride a horse, right? This is a 19th century phenomenon. Okay. All right. Not one of the guard escaped, every man being killed or wounded. Again, Rufus Dawes is dealing with some heavy stuff here. 420 men started as a regiment from the turnpike fence. That's the Chambersburg Pike, of whom 240 reached the railroad cut. Years afterward, I found the distance passed over to be 175 paces. He's still struggling with this years later. I'm thinking of Some of you know William Oates commanded the 15th Alabama. His brother was mortally wounded in the attack on Little Round Top. And in early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt made William Oates, who was also governor of Alabama at one point, made him in charge of all Southern monuments being placed across the country. And he could have come to Gettysburg and looked at the battlefield. Maybe at least you would think he would have returned to see where his brother fell. He got a telegram in Montgomery, Alabama in the early 1900s that his brother's body was found and that it had been moved along with the remains of others to Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery. And he still had this unresolved business that he thought his brother died right away in the fight on Little Round Top. And he learned years later that his brother hadn't died, and he had 7 bullets in him. And he thought that his brother must have, he wondered what his brother must have thought, that he had been abandoned. And that really worked on him. And there's evidence of him in the early 1900s, William Oates, taking a train that went right through Hanover Junction, about 20 miles east of here, on his way to Harrisburg. There's no evidence that I've ever found of him visiting the battlefield. You and I walked a Little Round Top, and we see it as this special place. And of course, all definitions of it would make it a special place. But it's a place we want to go and stand. He couldn't bring himself 20 miles away to come here and stand there again, because of the feelings he had, the phobias he had, and what his brother must have felt dying. Eventually, he gained some kind of closure. I guess William Oates started corresponding with the surgeon, who's still alive, who cared for his brother, and told him what his last minutes were like. Okay, and Rufus Dawes is clearly trying to purge something here. He said, goes on to say, years afterward I found the distance. Every officer proved himself brave, true, and heroic, and encouraging the men to breast this deadly storm. But the real impetus, that is the drive, was the eager, determined valor. There's that word again, true, heroic, valor. These are all romantic terms in the literature of our men who carried muskets in the ranks. The rebel color would be seen waving defiantly just to the edge of the road. I put the mention of the colors several times because colors are something else that you need to notice in the accounts. Colors represent, a flag in battle represents 2 things. On a battlefield you can't hear. Okay, you know that if your ears aren't stuffed really good with cotton here at Gettysburg, material from clothing, your eardrums rupture, blood streams down the side of your face, and sometimes blood will come out of your nose from the concussions of the noise. It's the sounds are overwhelming and it's jarring, and headaches can last forever, and it can be other post-traumatic stress disorders related to the sound. I remember my father he was in Korea, and during the Korean conflict, and he would never take my sister and I to 4th of July fireworks. We never went to any of them growing up. It's just the noise. He never talked about it. It would trigger thoughts associated with the noise. But on a battlefield, it's so noisy, you can't hear. So you have to have nonverbal ways of communicating. Like when Penn State plays football and the Ohio State comes in and it's a whiteout and there's 80,000 fans cheering. Ohio State knows before they get there they can't hear any of the calls. They will not hear any of the calls. So they have silent counts. You'll see the quarterback, he looks like he has some nervous reaction. He keeps doing his heel like this. And you say, what's going on there? It's an involuntary motion. No, he's communicating non-verbally for the receiver to run behind him, to draw the best defender away from the play, which is going to go in that direction. And or everything is on, you don't move until the ball moves because you can't hear. And they're talking in a helmet, and they've got, on a battlefield, much worse, you can't hear. So the flag has to be bright to be seen through the smoke. And the flag means 2 things, location and possession. So if you can't hear, your enemy knows. When Armistead's men planted the rebel flag in the stone wall in Pickett's charge, they were saying, we own this. And that would have drawn the ire of the Union's soldiers to double down on holding that place. I remember when Fort McHenry, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night our flag was still there. The British shelled that during the War of 1812 over and over and over. When the light came up, there was the flag still flapping, and it was the Americans saying, you know, we're in the midst of rubble now and the fort's destroyed, but we're not going anywhere, we own this place. Or when the Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, took a naval flag and raised it. It was not for a photo op, it was to, they had taken the high ground, and it was to demonstrate to everyone in foxholes down below in areas not secured, we own this island. It's just a matter of time before we control the whole island. So you're sending the message, we own this, we have possession. It means location too. If the company F is usually the center company, and there's about 40 in the company, they've all been told where to go in case the first 2 or 3 flag bearers are shot down. Your opponent knows that everything depends, and that noise on the flag going to the right place, so they fire upon the flag bearer first. So there's the point going forward. I wanted you to see when the flag waves, this is all nonverbal communication. The flag is saying, we still own this, this is where we're supposed to be. Okay, and then he talks about Corporal Eggleston of Company H, a mere boy. Again, he's struggling with things, he's purging things. Rufus Dawes says this boy sprung forward to seize it and was shot dead the moment his hand touched the collar. Private Anderson of his company, furious of the killing of his brave young comrade, swung aloft his musket and with a terrific blow split the skull of the rebel who shot young Eggleston. If you read Rufus Dawes' report, it's not this graphic, it's not this detailed. This is something he's trying to get rid of years later. Into this deadly melee rushed Corporal Francis Waller, who seized and held the rebel flag. That means something. That means you own it, and you own that position. His name will remain upon the historic record as he received the Congressional Medal. I would require many pages to justly recount the heroic deeds of all, but one incident is so touching in its character that it should be preserved. Corporal James Kelly of Company B turned from the ranks, stepped beside me, and as we both hurriedly forward on the charge, he pulled open his woolen shirt, and a mark where the deadly minie ball had entered his breast was visible. Can you see that man running up alongside Dawes? He said, Colonel, won't you please write to my folks that I died a soldier? So these are things that he's trying to erase from his memory and put on paper. Here's another example of post-traumatic stress disorders. Captain Francis Moran, 73rd New York Infantry. He writes after the fight in the Peach Orchard, the poor horses. You remember Bigelow's battery and all of the artillery pieces in the Peach Orchard? We say about 5,000 horses and mules were killed here at Gettysburg in 3 days, or died from broken legs rushing to the battlefield with wheeled vehicles. There were hundreds of horses killed, a lot of them bayoneted in the throat. The Confederates charged the artillery pieces of Bigelow, Phillips, Ames, Hart, Dow, and bayoneted the horses in the throat so they would collapse, and then the cannons couldn't get away, and that would allow the Confederates to take them and fire on Union men. The artillery waited probably too long to leave, and fortunately they got out of there and they were able to the next day repulse Pickett's charge. But a lot of horses were maimed all around the Peach Orchard. Look at the photographs of all the dead horses. It took till Christmas, the newspapers were reporting plumes of fire and smoke on the southern end of the battlefield where they were still burning horse flesh 5 months after the battle. The poor horses fared badly, Moran remembered, and as we passed, scores of these ungazetted heroes stood upon their main limbs regarding us with a silent look of reproach that was almost human expression. So just to add a little more, I didn't put the whole quote, but he talks about how Confederate artillery shells came into where he was in the Peach Orchard and was hitting the fences, and the fence rails were spinning around like giant toothpicks. It's very graphic. I don't recall him mentioning the barn catching fire, but that was a major event too. That Shurfee barn caught fire, burned to the ground. 20th Maine went in there the day after. They were picking up weapons on the battlefield, sending them back to Springfield, Massachusetts to be reconditioned by rail. And as they were walking around, they went in the Shurfee barn and found a dozen or so charred remains of wounded who crawled in there and couldn't get out when the barn caught fire. But with the barn blazing and with fence rails flying around and with horses lying around bleeding and some missing parts of legs. Moran, by the way, he had balloon red trunks, short vested blue coat, and a toboggan cap called a fez cap. He was wearing the French North African Zouave clothing. He was part of the fireman regiment. And I've always wondered what he thought about the Sherpy barn on fire. You know, he was a fireman in New York City. So there he was, and he couldn't move, but he got up just enough and he looked around, and all these horses remained looking at him. They're looking at him like, why do you humans do this to each other? Again, that stuck with him, and he writes about it. First Lieutenant Alexander Wallace Given, Company F, 114th Pennsylvania. They wore the Zouave uniforms too, and they were at the peach orchard. Alexander Wallace Given writes, for instance, Sergeant John Guinness of Company E, who had charge of the detail, responded to a poor fellow for a drink of water, leaned forward so as to bring the canteen to his lips. This is after the fighting on July 2nd, somewhere around the peach orchard. Second day of the battle. Every soldier and officer in the time of battle provides himself with at least a half a canteen of water. The tape of the canteen is tied in a knot, so the strap is tied in a knot. Over the right shoulder, canteen kept close under the left arm. This was done to prevent it from spilling. So if you get that knot in the right place, the canteen won't tip, and with a loose stoppage, you won't lose any water. Water's precious on the battlefield. For every drop is precious. Lieutenant Alfred Newland, who was temporary in command of my own Company F, called out during the battle, "I will give $5 for a canteen of water," but no one would give him any. With no disrespect to an officer, it was said, let him carry his own water. So water, you all know water is as good as gold on the battlefield. And if you've ever been injured, it could be intentional, a surgery, or it could be something that was accidental. The first thing that happens after you're injured, intentional or otherwise, is you're incredibly thirsty. If you're in a hospital, you're given intravenously, so you're not as thirsty. But if you hadn't been, you would be incredibly thirsty. So you go from strength to sudden weakness, and it happens instantaneously, and you want water. That's why the two timeless calls on the battlefield for thousands of years, regardless of the war era, are mom, mom, and water. You'd have heard that like a chorus all night on July 2nd. Water, water, mom, mom. And psychologists say the call for mom on battlefields has to do with, as it gets darker and darker in your head, you go into levels of subconscious. A young man is taken back to when he was 8 or 9 years of age, and he has a nightmare in the middle of the night. Mom, mom. So there's that, and there's the call for water. That's why you have the Angel of Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg as a statue to someone who went out in the cold in the December with snow on the ground after the Union had made all those charges at the stone wall. And he gave water and kept calling for him to give water. Now, as he goes out then, as water's being doled out here, something unusual happens. This is probably PTSD too that he's writing about this. The dying man grasps Sergeant Guinness. He has the canteen of water. He's giving water to the wounded out in no man's land. With both hands, and drew him so close their eyes glared into each other. So the man comes up from the ground and grabs the canteen, pulls him down, and gets right up in his face. It was a paroxysm, a sudden and powerful expression of death. It was his last gasp. And quick as thought, Sergeant Guinness out with his knife. Every soldier carried a sharp knife, and he knew when and where to use it. He cut the tape of his canteen and left in his hands of the dead soldier. Came quickly to me. Sergeant Guinness was a brave soldier, but this was more than he could bear, for he almost collapsed as he told me. And I mentioned the sharp knife as we're doing archaeology of the mind here and paying attention to things we don't normally pay attention to on a battlefield tour. Sharp knife. He says every soldier carried a sharp knife. It was very common in both armies to carry knives. Now, the Army didn't issue them, but you could buy them from the sutler, or you could bring one from home. You used it to shave. You would use it to cut branches in the woods, or vines, or things that would stick to your clothing. Use it to cut up twigs when you're trying to start a fire. Just an endless number of things that you'd use the knife for. And he took time to mention that in his account. This is Frank Haskell now. Frank Haskell this is before Pickett's charge. He was on the reverse side of Cemetery Ridge on the Union side. He was an aide-de-camp to John Gibbon, who commanded a division of the 2nd Corps, Hancock's 2nd Corps at Gettysburg. And he wrote this wonderful account. He was a student at Dartmouth. He went to Dartmouth in New Hampshire. And he also practiced law in Madison, Wisconsin. Just an outstanding writer. So look for what we talked about at the very beginning in the introduction about this flowery writing. This ability to write in a way where you visualize something through words. Bell's letters, if you will. We dozed in the heat and lolled upon the ground with half eyes open. Our horses were hitched to the trees, munching some oats. A great lull rested upon all the field. Time was heavy, and for want of nothing better to do, I yawned and looked at my watch. It was 5 minutes before 1 o'clock. Well, you all know the cannonade opened at 1 o'clock. Ex uno deus omnes, which means in Latin, from one person learn all persons. So he wrote in Latin, and I put the brackets in there to break it down for you. From one we can judge the rest. He's saying, hey, my experience applies to everybody that was there. My attitude and purpose were those of the general and the rest of the staff. Now, notice he dozed in heat and lolled upon the ground. Soldiers looked for every opportunity to sleep, because you never knew when you were going to get a chance to sleep again. And you might be so exhausted you had no trouble sleeping. They learned how to cherish those moments where they could fall asleep. Second, I want you to notice he looked at his watch. Waltham, Massachusetts had the first, or one of the first that we know of, watches that were made from assembly, where there were mechanized parts that were assembled in a factory-like setting. So they were affordable. $13 you could buy one. And you say, oh, that's an old pocket watch. Hey, having that was like having an Apple Watch today. He wants you to know he had an Apple Watch. He wants you to know that. Yeah, so anyway, I couldn't resist that. Watches were, they were wind up, and there were 23 different railroad companies, which meant there were 23 different time zones. There was no standard time, and that's why the times are all over the place when soldiers record the time. But nevertheless, he had one. And we don't want to get into this, but academic historians, we don't have time to get into this, but academic historians look at the introduction of the watch as not only the introduction of mechanization and industrialization and affordability and all that, but it represents capitalism, when time is money, when you start watching the clock. You know, the first church bells that ring in accordance with a clock in the Middle Ages. Well, now the day is being broken up by sound and by time, which means time is money. They're paying attention to profit now, not just making a craft. So these are important impressions in the letters. Haskell says, what sound was that? This is at 1 o'clock. There was no mistaking it. The distinct, sharp sound of one of the enemy's guns square over the front caused us to open our eyes and turn them in that direction when we saw directly above the crest the smoke of the bursting shell. Can't you almost see it right above you? The bursting shell right over Cemetery Ridge just before Pickett's charge. And heard its noise. Saw and heard. Light travels faster than sound. So they saw it first and then heard the burst. In an instant before a word was spoken, as if the signal gun for general work, loud, startling, booming, the report of the gun after gun in rapid succession smote our ears. Notice the startling. You ever been startled, caught off guard, didn't know somebody was there or whatever? Okay, and that's what he's talking about. They're startled. They feel it almost a kind of an outer body experience. Okay, he writes, the mighty din, this is a Dartmouth student now, the mighty din that now rises to heaven and shakes the earth is not in all of it the voice of the rebellion. For our guns, the guardian lines of the crest, quick to awake when danger comes, have opened their fiery jaws and begin to roar. The great hoarse roar of battle, how the long streams of fire spout from the guns, how the rifled shells hiss, how the smoke deepens and rolls. As we said in the introduction, the writers back then were taught to be very visual with their writing because they had very few illustrations. You learn how to paint word pictures, and he's really got it down. And he says, guardian lines of the crest. How many of you have seen the 78th New York, 102nd New York monument on Culp's Hill? It has a lion embedded into the side. Carved in, it looks like a group of rocks, but if you look at it a second time and really strain with your eyes, you can think, oh my gosh, those are not just rocks in the monument. That's the outline of a lion's face, which means courage. But it also means in the Middle Ages, people carried heraldry. How many of you knew that? They'd walk in, there would be a banner, and they would hold it up, and they would roll this flap down. It was very colorful, and oftentimes it had lions all over it. Or they would wear, they would put a garment over the horse. Sometimes it was over the metal of the horse, if it was armored, and it had little lions all over it. Lions oftentimes were symbols of heraldry. And part of family crest. Well, no matter what your family name is, look back and there's probably a lion woven into it somewhere, along with a ship and maybe something else. So guardian lines of the crest, in the time before Social Security numbers, before modern forms of identification, people carried heraldry and flags that announced who they were. If they didn't announce themselves individually, they announced themselves collectively. That's why losing the flag was so devastating to them. That was their identity. That was their community's identity in a time when people were largely anonymous. So, the guardian lines of the crest. That's also a throwback to the romance of the Middle Ages, the imagined past. Fiery jaws begin to roar. All right, you have to understand that in the 19th century, people had an underlying tension in fear of their world suddenly ending. Some of you are old enough to remember mutual assured destruction. MAD. There'll never be a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Why? Because both sides understand there's no winner in a nuclear war. Everyone's destroyed. So that was this unspoken psychological guard against nuclear wars. That you couldn't use it because it was not winnable. You would also lose as well. Okay. That idea, though, that there could be at any time nuclear war, and there were bomb shelters in this country, and school kids would get under their desk. It didn't do a lot of good, but fire hydrants would go off, and there were drills in the school. That fear of the war, suddenly people on pins and needles and pointing fingers, and there was that underlying tension in the 50s. Well, coming out of World War II, where 50 million people died, people were on pins and needles, and the world was drawn in half. Soviet Union or the United States and European allies. Well, that kind of fear existed in the 19th century with the growth of industrialization. People believed virtue was related to agriculture and owning your land and getting dirt under your fingernails and staying away from the highfalutin society by chopping wood and building fences, staying connected to the land, small property owners, and then looking out for people around you. It's called Republican virtue. It has nothing to do with the political party. That was an 18th century concept of what democracy was. And when there was all this immigration, the Irish in the 1830s, 40s, and the Germans in the 1840s and 50s, people worried social ills from Europe and their factories and all the talk of organizing and labor were going to find their way into the United States and destroy their concept of virtue. So there was a fear, too, of the waters being polluted and smokestacks putting poison in the sky and waters being polluted and so on, and the resources being used up. And there was a fear that the French Revolution sent shockwaves through the country. 1,400 people were guillotined. All of Europe worried that that was coming to their country. And I could say a lot more about this, but there never had been a country that existed like the United States, where government came from the consent of the governed. And so what people worried is that Europe kept saying there's no government that can exist long without an aristocracy. You know, where there's social betters and an order in society. People can't govern themselves and from within. By the way, every time our country has an election, it has been this way for a couple hundred years. Every 2 years, the world holds their breath, wondering how a country of our size somehow manages to stay together. You realize that France and most of the European countries you know about are about the size of Texas. Because one of the things that Europeans are always struck when they come to this country is how huge the United States is. The United States is Eastern and Western Europe combined in size. And we managed to govern ourselves. So there was this fear in the 1860s, particularly with 3 revolutions in France and all kinds of revolutions breaking out in different parts of the world. There was a fear that at any point the wheels are going to come off and this experiment couldn't last. And the Civil War was like a self-fulfilled prophecy. It's going to happen. So the writing of the time reveals sudden destruction, chaos. They think it's the end of the world. Their worst fears have come true. This kind of government can't work. It lasted, Lincoln said 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to visit a final resting place. He's saying, that this experiment has lasted 87 years, but in Europe, there were monarchs in Europe chuckling in the background. See? 87 years, that's all it took, and the wheels came on. And the Civil War represented the worst case scenario. So how did people deal with that? Well, they expressed their underlying fear of the democracy suddenly collapsing by making the unnatural natural. Singer sewing machines are unnatural, but you put flowers on them and they're natural. Bathtubs are unnatural, but you put lion claws on the base of them, they're natural. A door might be unnatural, but if you put a lion on the front and somebody has to hit a knocker and they see a lion, then it's natural. This is unnatural, this smartphone, but it has an apple on the back and it's in an otter case, so it's natural. So they were afraid of, you look at a rifle sometimes and it has these ornate carvings, brass carving plates. You think, what is all this artistry on a rifle? It was art reflects culture. And it was artists trying to express the inner anxieties in people's subconscious, that industry and agriculture can coexist together, that virtues won't be destroyed. But notice the writing back then uses anthropomorphism and personification. Anthropomorphism is giving a divine quality to an innate object. Personification is giving human characteristics to an innate object. So here's how does a rifle have fiery jaws and begin to roar? That's personification. You're making it natural. It has a hoarse roar. Well, how does a cannon have a hoarse roar? Streams of fire spout. And this Dartmouth writer tells us that these guns, that's the rebel guns firing and the Union replying and the cannonade before Pickett's charge. He said these guns are great infuriate demons. Well, that's anthropomorphism. That's giving divine characteristics to innate objects. Not of the earth, whose mouths blaze. Well, how does a rifled cannon have a mouth? Smoky tongues. Talk about visual writing. Murky breath. That the smell of sulfur. Ceaseless roar. That's a lion. Projectile shriek. Scream, growl, chaos. I want you to notice that in the future when you read soldier accounts. They try to give human qualities to metal in innate objects. It's a way of identity. It's like you and I call in a hurricane, Hurricane Katrina. You're trying to make it a little bit friendlier. Give it or Hurricane Andrew. So we take something that's disastrous and give it a name that allows our mind to wrap around it and make it more natural. John Dooley, we mentioned him earlier, the Confederate. He wrote, "To the right of us and above the guns," this is Pickett's charge, "we are to capture black heavy monsters from their lofty mountain sites, belch forth their flame." That's personification. Giving human attributes to things that are not human. "And smoke and storms of shot and shell upon our advancing line, while directly in front, breathing flame in our very faces, the long-range guns, quivering, melting ranks." Quivering, melting ranks. Personification. Charles Sprague, Company E, 44th New York, writes, "It is strange how in such a moment of excitement your mind is busy with some absurdly trifling thought, and how plainly you remember." And he goes on, and I'll tell you what, we're getting right here to the end, so I'm going to wrap up with a couple slides, and then we'll take, I'll stay here for questions. But I'm going to move on down to, he mentions, "I was listening during that heavy artillery fire," says Sprague of the 44th New York, "and he was marching en route to Little Round Top, where he would defend there on the second day." And he also blends that in with a memory of Chancellorsville. He says, "I was listening during that heavy artillery fire to some little birds whose high treble notes did not seem to be in the least interfered with the deeper tones. I noticed several things as we ran along." That's en route to Little Round Top on the second day. This is the regiment from Albany, 44th New York. Sprague says, "One was a cannonball, which looked as if it was passing just in front of our alert little major's face, just above his horse's ears. It seemed probably it was further off. He must have dismounted soon, for I did not see any horse after that. Another thing I noticed was a fox, the only wild one I saw at large. The little fellow must have been so frightened by an exploding shell or something as to lose fear of men, and he almost ran under our feet." So the fox was, try to imagine them marching to Little Round Top, coming up the backside, and the noise is so jarring that the fox had lost his way, and in broad daylight walked right in amongst the troops. And notice too how keen Sprague is to noticing birds chirping and foxes walking through his line. And the reason is that when cortisol and adrenaline are going through your head, that's panic. A battle, by the way, is all panic attack. It's all complete panic attack. The Marine Corps and the Green Beret and the Navy SEALs, their motto is, their training is for one thing, is to teach the body to do the right thing when the mind shuts down. Because when you're in a panic attack, and that's what battles are, you freeze and you forget everything. You're paralyzed. But if somebody has spent 11 weeks training your muscles to do the right thing through repetition, if there are any young people, the reason why they make you shoot layups all the time and foul shots in practice and run layup drills and passing drills, the reason for the repetition is that when the first roar of the crowd occurs in a big game and your head floods with cortisol and adrenaline, you do it automatically without thinking about it. That's what it's about. I talked to two veterans years ago that were in D-Day. And as the amphibious boats were arriving on June 6, 1944 on the shores of Normandy, and as they hit that beach with barbed wire and Nazi crossfire, they had to cross the beach until they got to the base of the cliff. And that area was terrible crossfire. And these two men crossed that space while others around them were killed or wounded, made it to the base of the cliff, climbed ropes or found narrow passages to make it to the top, silenced the German guns, and didn't remember any of it. But they did the right thing. So there were people in the battle here that remembered very little of it. Or when you have a panic attack and cortisol and adrenaline is swimming through your head, what it does is it creates false impressions of there's enough fears that are real, but then there are imagined fears, and that's what PTSD is trying to sort the two out afterwards. Feeling irrational guilt for someone that was killed beside you, that you have no responsibility for, and then later on you try to write about it. But your sensitivities are heightened in that condition because the blood leaves your brain. When cortisol and adrenaline goes to the brain, blood leaves the brain, it goes to the muscles to make them stronger so you can fight or flight. Either go forward or flight. And if you haven't been trained for either, you'll freeze. And so that's why the training, it's all about programming you. So when the mind shuts down, you'll just automatically do what you need to do. But in that heightened awareness that you have of the cortisol and adrenaline, you notice every little thing. And it moves almost in slow motion. I was talking to a veteran, a lieutenant colonel of the First War in the Gulf, Colonel Joe Ish, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Ish. He's one of our volunteers, and he was saying that he was over in the Second War, First War in the Gulf, and he was saying that there was a plane that took off. He watched it. He watched it suddenly lose altitude no sooner than it had gotten altitude. Then he saw the parachute come out, and then he saw the explosion. He said people around him didn't see it. He saw it. And to him, he said it was like a slow-moving drama. He saw the whole thing, and remember, your mind slows it down and sees it in some kind of captured dramatic motion. So this is what he's trying to unveil in his mind. All right, one more. I'm going to show you one more. Last one. This is William Fletcher. He's in Company F, 5th Texas. This is fight or flight personified. He was in the 5th Texas on a little round top. It's the third day of the battle. He thinks he's going to have to attack again. I was at the time on the dark side of life's thoughts, or in other words, hope in a depressed condition. While behind the rock penetration, that would be on Big Round Top, in the evening of the second day, July 2nd, 1863, word passed along the line to get ready to charge the front. The order shocked me, and my feelings were indescribable. In fact, I had a bad case of cowardly horror. I felt as sure if I retraced my steps the evening before, it would be the ending of me. I could not object in the move, only to sacrifice the extreme left to save the army and retreat, as I felt we had gotten a good whipping all along the line, and I was considering which was preferable, disgrace or death. For I felt as one feels when fright and disgrace at one and same time have possession. He's being very honest here, isn't he, about his feelings. That's fight or flight. Go forward, not go forward. But if you're trained, you still go forward, or you still do what you're trained to do, even when your feelings are all... You know, if the lights were to suddenly shut down in this building from a power failure outside, the generator would come on. You all know that, right? There would be lower lights. They wouldn't be as powerful, but there would be kind of a glow through the building because we have a backup generator. In a similar way, when you're in battle, in fight or flight, you're operating with cortisol and adrenaline. You are operating on a fight or flight mode, not in a logical thought process mode. So you fall back into your generator mode, and that generator mode has to be conditioned for a moment like this. He said, I tried to force manhood to the front, but fright would drive it back with a shudder. I was in a state of torture for at least 15 minutes. I was laying behind rock protection and dropped asleep with fear and disgrace to be my portion. I had slept but a few minutes when our batteries behind opened fire on the enemy's supposed line to confuse, and then we would be ordered to charge. The guns were not elevated enough, and were doing fine work on our position. The bursting and flying pieces of the shell and rock put us in a panic condition. We could not drop to the front and protect ourselves, for we would be exposed to the enemy. Our field officers just to our rear were dismounted and had great trouble to mount. They soon got a few mounted, giving help, and ran to the rear and stopped firing. All was confusion, but we got back into line and orders countermanding the charge were passed down the line. When I awoke, my fears had gone, and when I heard the countermanding order, I had a feeling of regret, thinking of what a great relief we could be to our wounded by dropping our canteen by their sides. So he's in this condition where he's relieved, suddenly relieved, that the order's been countermanded. They don't have to go forward. But at the same time, he feels regret that he's not doing what soldiers do in battle, and that is you don't leave without taking everyone with you or carrying to each person there. So you can tell he's struggling with this. What is mine causes it to change. Notice too that he said that he fell asleep. Wanted to come back to that. Did you all know the 20th Maine, after they fought on Little Round Top and repulsed 15th Alabama, as soon as they were told that their mission was complete, guess what they did? They dropped at the base of Little Round Top and fell asleep. And they didn't know how long. They were exhausted. And veterans will tell you that when you're on the front lines, trivial things, you don't think about trivial things. Did I pay the bills this month? Did I turn off my light at home? No, it's only survival. So when that mission is complete, then you fall asleep. So that's just a little bit today of climbing into the soldiers' minds and unearthing some of their secrets. Thank you for coming out today. What will happen, I was speaking to a soldier that was in Vietnam, and he said, what happens is, soldiers that are in your platoon will hear some fire, and they just all hit the ground, and they're not being given an order. They just all hit the ground. And one of the things that officers teach is, you always hear lead from the front, lead from the front. But a point that was made out of this example in officer training was sometimes you have to lead from the rear or from behind. Instead of being in front, all the soldiers hit the ground, you're still going forward, you turn and they're frozen. So you walk around behind them, and then you have to get them to move forward, because where they are is in a purgatory. They're not going to make it if they stay there. They have to go forward. It's not safe. But your instincts are, I was talking to a man that was in the first war in the Gulf, and he said that that whole area was sand and it was flat. But as soon as the first rounds were fired, he got down into the sand and he just couldn't. He just tried to make himself one with it. It's an instinctive thing. A lot of times you're not ordered to hit the ground. It's just something you do instinctively. And like a horse, a lot of times, you have to put blinders on when you take them over water, because if they look off the bridge to either side, they won't move, and you have to keep pulling them. In a similar way on a battlefield, soldiers instinctively try to get as low as possible. They just grab to anything. And so that's, and another aspect too of hitting the ground. Occasionally you are ordered to hit the ground. And I'll give you an example here. I talked to a lot of veterans here. I was talking to a veteran that was in the war in Iraq in the mid-2000s. He said he was in a Humvee, and they were behind another Humvee, and the one in front of them went over an IED, and it got turned over. And he said the men that were in his Humvee all got out. And he said when they got out, immediately you could tell which soldiers had never been in combat and which ones had. Because he said the ones that hadn't been in combat were in disbelief. Even if they had been trained for what to expect, they hadn't actually experienced it. So they would get out and they would hear, and he described it this way. And he said the soldiers that had never been in combat would look around in disbelief. And those who had already experienced it, he said it was rude, but we tackled them. Get down, get down, get down,
and I didn't get into this, and this would have been something really good to get into, but veterans go through 4 stages in combat of thinking. First stage is when the shooting first starts. First stage is, I didn't do anything to him or her, whatever. Why are they doing that to me? That's the first thought. It doesn't matter how long you've been trained. First thought is, why are they firing upon me? I didn't do anything to them. That's a natural reaction. My wife was a high school art teacher for 30 years, and they would have training on bullying and things like that, intimidation. And that's, a lot of times students will say that have been bullied. The first thought that's going through their mind, they tell the counselors, I don't know why they're doing that to me. I didn't do anything to them. That's instinctively the first thing when you're threatened. I don't know why they're doing it. All right, second stage in combat. I don't know why they're doing that to me, but I'm going to do what I was trained to do. That's because you were programmed. If you're an empty vessel, you'll stand there frozen, paralyzed, and you won't make it. But if you've been programmed through boot camp, you'll go right into the second, which is, I'll do what I was trained to do. And so you just go through all of the things that you're trained to do at that point. My father said he had to, and before he went to Korea, they made them disassemble their rifle, bury the individual parts with a shovel. And I was talking to someone in the note, they still do this today. And then you, with a timer and the sergeant standing there, you have to undig each part, clean it to the level of inspection, reassemble it, and stand with it ready to present. And they time you. And you do that over and over and over again, because they know when the battle's going on, your mind's going to shut down. But through the repetition, you'll be able to do something even that meticulous. So, in any case, going back, first stage is, I don't know why they're doing that to me. I didn't do anything to them. Second stage is, I don't know why they're doing that, but I'm going to do what I was trained to do. Third stage, I didn't do that. I'm not capable of that. And this is where war guilt comes in. Somebody dies beside them, or they themselves are responsible for somebody else getting wounded. And so the thought is I can never be a good person again. And then there's the cortisol and the adrenaline, the panic attack, that can't separate reality from what's imagined. That's PTSD. So they have these heightened fears that are not real, along with real fears. And sometimes that's why veterans hospitals have regular follow-ups with veterans who will fall out of society for a while. They're stuck in stage 3. They see a person come out of them they didn't know existed in stage 3 to survive. Remember the Incredible Hulk? He's this thin guy, business guy, wears a business shirt, looks ordinary, wearing glasses, and suddenly something happens that's wrong. He witnesses it, and he starts to turn green, and his muscles get bigger, and the shirt rips. And then he does justice right there and does the right thing and saves the day. And then later on, he's in an alley, he's thin again, and his shirt is shredded, and he's no longer green. He's no longer the Hulk. He's just an ordinary businessman. And he's sweating, and his heart's pounding from the panic. Basically what's happened is he became something that scared him in that moment to bring about justice. That's what happens in a battle, is that it's like opening a Pandora's box, and then that person sometimes gets stuck in stage 3. They can never blend back into society again. They can never be good again because they've killed. Or there's this irrational thought, the person beside me died, I can never look their family in the face again back home. I should have done something. Well, it's irrational. The psychologist tells you, look, you were doing your duty. You're not responsible directly for him. Even though you've been trained, there are things beyond your control. But you still feel that chemically induced shame or fear that you could have done more to save his life. And then stage 4, and this is where the psychologists try to get veterans with PTSD. Stage 4 is, I did it, that was me, I did what I was trained to do, and I can sleep at night. And when you get to that stage, then they're healed. But I'm on the safety committee here at the park, and we meet once a month and we approve the minutes from the last, and every single month on the safety report, there are people that, veterans go to the cyclorama, they go up to the cyclorama, and the soundtrack goes off, the surround sound, artillery shells and everything, and they're not aware about it, somehow or another didn't register that's what was going to happen. And they start to, and then the people that are up there working are trained to recognize that. They get them on an elevator and out of there real quick. Because what's happening is they're slipping from stage 4 back to stage 3. That sound is jarring them and taking them back into something they never sorted out in their mind. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear, but you all seem interested there. And here's a couple more. This one's an easy one here. Coffee and treetops. This is more of a fun one. W.C. Rife of the 91st Pennsylvania was on Little Round Top. He said we gathered these coffee kettles, collected them, and then he goes on to talk about how he was selected to make the trip to get the water for the coffee. And he started off, walked down Little Round Top. Let me assure you that wasn't such an easy task as you might think. He talks about the rebel sharpshooters were in the treetops across Plum Run and in and about Devil's Den. And he remembers this. It could be something humorous to him, something lighthearted, but it also could be, again, a sense of unfairness, that they're in treetops and I'm just trying to fill up canteens. That's unfair, that's unchivalrous. And the chivalric code from the Middle Ages had sort of been reduced and reintroduced in the 19th century. So there's a sense of unfairness that he's still dealing with. But the Confederates did this too. I was going to mention this from a military standpoint. On Culp's Hill, the Confederates climbed trees. And the reason is the Union had field fortifications. So at ground level, there was no way to fight with the Union. But if you get into a tree, and you could then see over the field fortification. So it was to try to paint a picture for people maybe they didn't have about the treetops and talk about the chivalric code. And then lastly, this is something else we didn't get into pretty deep, but just maybe quickly here. Major Hancock, General Winfield Scott Hancock, who commanded the 2nd Corps in the Union Center against Pickett's charge, he said from 11 a.m. there was an ominous stillness. About 1 o'clock, apparently by a given signal, the enemy opened upon our front with the heaviest artillery fire I've ever known. Now, what's going on here psychologically, and that's what we did a lot today on this program, is the contrast between ominous stillness and heaviest artillery fire I have ever known. Notice the extremes. Alfred Hitchcock's movies were based on these extremes. His whole secret to being a great movie producer was, he would put 2 people at a table and they're talking, and then below the table, the person sitting in the theater could see something that endangered both of their lives under the table. But the people sitting at the table couldn't see it. So you had to wait. He used that technique for the suspense to build. You knew what was going to happen, and the characters didn't know what was going to happen. But it was a moment, his movies were largely built around that moment, where there's a tear in in normalcy, and there's sudden chaos. And maybe think about that in your own life. Hopefully you haven't dwelled on things like this, but maybe suddenly you get a call and somebody's passed away or somebody's in the hospital. It's your worst nightmare, and that's the kind of thing daily, maybe you pray under your lips or hope that will never happen, and then it happens. And it's like, okay, here we go. This worst case scenario is happening. All right, that humans have that, and those opposites. Calmness, but at the same time realizing the bottom could fall out at any moment. That's reality. Life and death are equally real. An instructor, Army officer instructor at Fort Leavenworth was telling me this story. He said when he used to do Army officer instructing, he said it went on for a couple weeks, and he said at one point about the halfway during the course, they would call for, out of 30 potential officers in training, the instructor would call for 2 volunteers. And of course he said to me, you never volunteer in the Army. But there would always be 2 that would raise their hand and walk up, and they put 2 chairs front. They put the chairs to their backs. Think of these two chairs with the backs of the chairs together. They're facing opposite directions. The two volunteers sit in either direction in the chair. They're looking away from each other. And the instructor says to the class, this person sitting in this chair represents life. The person facing the other way represents death. They're both equally real. And to a person who's emotionally healthy, they only should think about life. But the reality is death is always right there beside you, and that's the point of the illustration. We don't want to think about these kind of things where you could go home and the tire suddenly blow, and that's the end. It's that real. If we're emotionally healthy, we don't think on those things. But in combat, when you have a heightened awareness and sensitivity from the chemical changes up here, you're in combat, the instructor will say, are never more aware of how real death is. It's right there with you. So the soldier letters reflect that. The extreme, the normalcy, and suddenly there's chaos. And they'll have it in the same sentence. It was the stillest morning I ever saw. You wouldn't believe how calm it was. And then the earth rent with thunder and all of that. That's a picture of life and death. When they talk about birds chirping, that was another quote I didn't get to today, that verbally. Birds will be chirping, and you can hear babbling brooks, and it's called smelling the roses, taking time to smell the roses. When you have heightened senses, and your life's in danger, you notice, you hear the different octaves of the birds, things you never noticed before. You hear somebody's crunching of leaves, you're more sensitive to the sound of somebody walking near you. And you notice a lot of times beautiful pastoral scenes, and how beautiful all this is. And why did I never notice this before? And isn't that stream beautiful? And then you realize I'm trapped, I can't get out. Fight or flight is like that, there's nowhere to go. That's why the worst thing about hugging the ground is, if you're ordered to hug the ground, is you want to fight or flight, but you can't go either way. So you're like a caged animal. You can't do anything about it. So it's like acrophobia or claustrophobia. You're trapped. And it's the worst kind of fear. But notice the same contrast here. Robert Patterson, 19th Indiana Iron Brigade, says, of course I did not know the name of a single object with the scope of my vision, not even the little hamlet, that's Gettysburg, which lay in the valley of its heretofore peaceful hills, but which now reverberated with roar and clash. There's your opposing, you're going from one extreme to the next. One represents life and one represents death. And then O. Howard, the Major General, 11th Corps General, said the glorious landscape with its remarkable variety of aspect, its fresh sunlight, like a panorama was spread before our eyes. I need not rehearse its pictorial summary, the mountains, the groves, and the valley, with their variety of productions, or the streams of water. That's your picture of life. And he wrote that just before the ball opened, to use their words. And then Felix Brannigan of Company A, 73rd New York Fireman Brigade, he has the opposite. Like the roar of Niagara, like the howling of a hurricane in mid-ocean, like the subterranean rumbling of volcanic fires of Vesuvius. That's Pompeii. Ere they burst, the barriers which would hold the demon. That's Anthropomorphism. Hold the demon from his errand of havoc. You see that? The bottom falls out. You go from calmness to suddenly chaos. And that was in the subconscious of people, the whole country at that time. But also it naturally represents life and death. And then that was the end there. So that's all, you got the bonus material. Yeah, you're very welcome.